Hello, friend. Come in, settle down, get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket over your knees, maybe fix yourself something warm to hold onto, because tonight I want to take you somewhere that almost nobody thinks to go when they imagine the past. Not a battlefield. Not a royal court dripping in candlelight and velvet. A house. A plain, ordinary house, somewhere in rural New England, sometime in the 1750s. A house with a dirt-swept floor, walls that never quite kept the draft out, and a family of 6 or 7 crammed into a space smaller than most people's living rooms today. And here is the part that tends to catch people off guard the moment we step inside. What you are about to witness is not supper. It is not some peaceful gathering around the fire. It is the last hour before sunset. And in a world without electricity, without streetlights, without so much as a reliable match, that final hour of daylight was, for an ordinary family, something closer to a quiet emergency than a calm close to the day. Stay with me tonight, because by the time we're done, I don't think you'll ever watch a sunset the same way again. Before we go further, if this kind of slow, immersive history is something you find yourself sinking into, it would genuinely mean a lot if you subscribed and left this video a like. No rush. Do it whenever it feels right, whenever something in here catches you. And if you'd like to tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, drop it in the comments below. I read everyone. Now let the light in the room go a little dim if you can. Let everything else fall away. And let's go back, all the way back, to an ordinary evening in the year 1755, somewhere in the hill country of rural Massachusetts. Picture a farmhouse, a husband, a wife, 5 children between the ages of 2 and 15. Their home is a single main room with a sleeping loft above it, reached by a ladder worn smooth from years of small hands and feet. Attached to the back is a narrow lean-to, used half the year for storing tools and grain, and the other half for keeping a weak lamb or a sick goat away from the winter cold. The whole structure is perhaps 18 feet across and 15 feet deep. That is the entire world this family of 7 occupies, and right now, the sun is beginning its descent toward the tree line. You might picture that as something gentle. Golden light falling across a quiet field, the day easing itself down toward rest. But inside that little house, nobody is watching the sunset with any kind of peace. The mother, in particular, is watching it the way you'd watch a fuse burn down, because the instant that sun drops below the horizon, an entire set of tasks either gets finished, or it doesn't. And doesn't was never a small thing. Historians who study daily life in colonial New England and the Mid-Atlantic have traced this rhythm back to something very specific: inherited English labor law. Colonial authorities carried over an old statute, sometimes called the Statute of Laborers, which required able-bodied common folk to work from sunup to sundown. This wasn't a polite custom. It was, in many colonies, an actual legal expectation. The working day was measured not by a clock on a wall, but by the position of the sun itself. And when the sun disappeared, the day's business had to already be finished, because the alternative was trying to do it blind. So let's walk through that last hour together, because what this particular family needed to accomplish before full dark is, frankly, staggering to read about from where we sit now. The very first priority, and the one that admitted no negotiation whatsoever, was the animals. A modest farm household in the mid-1700s typically kept some combination of chickens, a hog or 2, maybe a milking cow, and if the family had climbed even one small rung up the ladder of prosperity, an ox or a horse for field work. None of these animals were companions in the way we think of pets today. They were the household's entire economic machinery. The cow meant butter and cheese. The chickens meant eggs and eventually meat. The hog, fattened all summer, would become the salted pork that carried the family through winter. And every single one of these animals had to be locked up, penned, or otherwise accounted for before darkness fell. Why the urgency? Because the countryside after dark was not the peaceful, moonlit backdrop we imagine from paintings. Foxes prowled. In parts of New England, wolves were still a genuine and documented threat to livestock well past the middle of the century. A chicken left loose in an open yard overnight had a real chance of being gone by morning, not lost, gone, carried off. A hog that slipped its pen in the dark might wander for miles and never be recovered. So in that final gold-lit hour, the household moved like a small, practiced machine. The oldest daughter drove the hens into their coop, counting heads twice, because a missing hen wasn't a minor annoyance. It was a real financial loss for a family living close to the edge. One of the younger boys hauled fresh water to the animal troughs, because nobody wanted to discover at 5 the next morning that the cow had gone dry overnight, and someone had to make an emergency trip to the well before breakfast could even be considered. The father, if he'd spent the day out in the far field, made one last pass along the fence line, checking for a loosened rail or a rotted post, because a fence that held fine at noon could give way by midnight, and a wandering cow in pitch darkness might not be found for days. Fences in this world were not decoration. They were survival infrastructure, and everyone treated them that way. I want you to sit with something for a moment. We use the phrase racing the clock pretty casually today, late for a meeting, rushing to hit a deadline. Stressful, sure, but usually recoverable. In a household like this one, the clock being raced was the sun itself, and losing that race didn't mean an awkward apology to a coworker. It meant total, absolute darkness. Not dim, not a little hard to see. Darkness so complete that even a familiar path to the barn became something closer to guesswork. We genuinely cannot picture this from where we live now. Even in the most remote corners of the modern world, there's some ambient glow somewhere, a distant town, a satellite blinking overhead, the soft light leaking from your own phone in your pocket. In this house, once the sun was gone and the fire inside was the only source of light left, and fuel for that fire had to be rationed carefully, the dark outside the door was total. Walking to check on a sick animal at midnight meant carrying a small lantern that a stiff breeze could snuff out in an instant, feeling your way across ground you'd walked 1,000 times in daylight and now couldn't recognize at all. This is why that last hour of sun mattered so much. Every task finished before dark was one less thing this family would have to attempt blind, but the animals were only half of the race. Inside the house, the mother had an entirely separate emergency of her own, running on the exact same clock. We're going to spend the next part of this journey sitting with her by the hearth, because what fire actually meant to a family like this one deserves its own full telling. For now, understand only this. Fire in 1755 was not something you simply switched on. There were no matches. The friction match wouldn't be invented until the 1820s, and it would take decades after that to reach an ordinary household's kitchen. To make fire from nothing, you needed flint, steel, and a nest of something dry enough to catch scraped bark, dried moss, sometimes a scrap of charred linen kept specifically for this purpose. You struck the flint against the steel, threw a spark into the tinder, and coaxed it gently, patiently into something that could grow. On a good day with dry materials and steady hands, this took a skilled woman perhaps 5 or 10 minutes. On a bad day, damp tinder, cold stiff fingers, wind gusting the wrong way, it could take far longer or fail outright. So the rule inside every colonial household worth its salt was simple and absolute. The fire does not go out. Because the fire was not just for cooking. It was the only heat source in a house with no insulation, in a region where frost could linger well into spring. It was the only light once the sun surrendered the sky. And it was the reason breakfast could exist at all the next morning, since a pot of cornmeal mush was often set to simmer low on banked coals overnight, ready and waiting at first light. So while the children ran the animals in, the mother was doing arithmetic by firelight, building the flame up enough to carry the household through the evening, but not so much that she'd burn through wood she couldn't easily replace. Wood, remember, was not an infinite resource. It had to be felled, split, hauled, dried for months, and stacked by hand, all in the brief window of a New England summer. A single cord, a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, represented real, exhausting labor. A modest one-hearth household could burn through 12 to 20 cords across a hard winter, And every one of those logs on the fire in December was a log someone had sweated over back in July. So this wasn't just tending a flame. It was constant, invisible calculation. How much wood tonight? How long will these coals hold? What can go in the pot now that will still be edible tomorrow? This mental math ran non-stop, expected of her by everyone around her, and remarked upon by absolutely no one. There's one more task from that final hour I want to tell you about, because I think it captures the actual texture of this life better than any broad claim about hardship ever could. The water. Nearly every rural household in this period drew its water from a well or a nearby stream. There was no running water of any kind anywhere in this house, and water is heavy. A single gallon weighs roughly 8.5 pounds, and a household like this one might need 10 or 12 gallons over the course of an evening and the following morning, for cooking, washing, and the animals. All of it had to be hauled before dark, because drawing water from a well by the light of one small candle lantern was slow, awkward, and genuinely risky. Drop the bucket wrong, lose your grip on the rope in the dark, and you had a real problem on your hands. So one of the middle children, old enough to manage the weight, young enough to still be the one assigned the errand, made trip after trip to the well in that last hour of light. Each trip perhaps 80 yards there and back. Each bucket 2 gallons, maybe a little more. 4 or 5 trips just to fill the household storage vessels for the night. By modern standards, this single chore would count as a proper workout. For a child in 1755, it was simply what Tuesday looked like. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. We talk a great deal today about self-care, about guarding our energy, about setting boundaries around our time, and I'm not dismissing any of that, it matters. But there's something quietly striking about looking at a household like this one and seeing a completely different shape of taking care of yourself. Finishing the evening's work wasn't a wellness routine. It was literal self-preservation. Every family member worked that hard in the day's last gold light because their actual survival, everyone's survival, depended directly on what got finished before the light ran out. And here's what moves me most about it. They didn't experience any of this as heroic. Nobody wrote proudly in a journal about how disciplined they'd been that evening. For them, it was just life, the plain, unremarkable texture of an ordinary Tuesday. The sun was going down. There was work left to do. So you did it. There's something in that unglamorous, unphotographed resilience that I think the modern world has quietly misplaced. I find myself admiring it more than I expected to. Let me bring you back to that little house one last time tonight. The hens are shut in. The hog is secured. The water barrels are full. The fire has been built up for the evening ahead. The father is walking back from the fence line, hands rough, shoulders carrying the particular exhaustion that only a full day of physical labor produces. The oldest boy is gathering the tools left outside, because anything left out overnight risked rust from the dew or simply vanishing into the dark and never being found again. The 2 youngest children are already inside, close to the hearth, watching their mother work. The smell in that one room right now is wood smoke and something faintly sweet simmering low over the coals. The sounds are the crackle of new wood catching, the low moan of wind finding every gap in the walls, the distant settling noises of animals bedding down in their pens. Outside, the sky is losing its color fast. The stars are beginning to needle through, and on a clear night, thick enough to show the pale band of the Milky Way stretched clean across the sky, in a way almost nobody watching this video has ever seen with their own eyes, because there is no artificial light for miles in any direction to wash it out. It's beautiful. But it isn't gentle, because everyone inside that house knows exactly what that darkening sky means. The workday is over, and the night, with everything it might bring, has just begun. What happens next inside those walls is what the rest of this journey is about. The fire at the center of everything. The meal that looks nothing like what you're picturing right now. The mother who won't rest for hours yet. The children facing a darkness we can barely imagine facing ourselves. The prayers whispered before sleep. And the fears that lived quietly alongside them. We've only just crossed the threshold tonight. Come with me. The next part of this evening is waiting. There is a sound almost nobody living today has ever truly sat with. Not a dramatic sound, no crack of thunder, no roar of a crowd, nothing that announces itself. Just the low, steady murmur of a wood fire breathing in a quiet room, the way it leans and settles, the way it lights one side of a face in amber and leaves the other in shadow. The way it fills a space with a kind of warmth no radiator or furnace has ever quite managed to copy, because it isn't only warmth you feel sitting near it. It's presence. For a family like the one we just left, fire wasn't a feature of the evening. It was the evening. Every evening without exception. And once you understand what a hearth truly demanded of a household, what it gave back, and what happened when it failed, you may never look at a flickering candle or a gas fireplace quite the same way again. Let's step inside properly this time. The first thing that would strike you, walking into a working New England farmhouse in the mid-1700s, is the sheer size of the fireplace. Nothing like the narrow, tiled, decorative fireplaces we see in home magazines today. This is a working hearth, built to the scale of the labor it had to support. In many older homes of the period, a cooking hearth might stretch 6 or 7 feet wide enough that a cook could actually step inside it, up onto the hearthstone itself, to stir a pot or turn a spit while flanked by fire on 3 sides. Some households built a small recess seat right into the side of the chimney breast, a warm nook tucked just inside the flue where a child could curl up on the coldest nights and stay close to the heat. This spot had its own name in the households that had one, the fire corner, sometimes called the chimney corner, and if you were small and lucky enough to be allowed to sit there, that was about as good as a winter evening got. The hearth wasn't just physically central to the home. In many New England houses, it was architecturally central. Homes were often built quite literally around a single massive chimney stack, sometimes weighing several tons, running straight up through the middle of the structure with multiple fireplaces on different floors all feeding into it. The logic here was sound, even if nobody in this household could have explained it in scientific terms. That enormous mass of brick soaked up heat all day and released it slowly through the night, functioning almost like a battery for warmth. Builders of the period understood this instinctively, passed down through generations of practical trial and error, long before anyone had a word like thermal mass to describe it. But here's what I want you to really feel, not just intellectually register. In this world, fire was not something you turned on. It didn't wait patiently for you, and it certainly didn't restart itself if you let it die. Fire was treated, quite genuinely, as something almost alive, something that had to be watched, fed, and protected every single hour of every single day. The first and least negotiable rule of running a colonial household was simply this: the fire must never go out. Not because restarting it was mildly inconvenient, but because it could cost hours, and in a Massachusetts January, hours without heat could mean real, serious suffering. Now, you might be thinking, surely it wasn't that difficult to just start a new fire. Except, again, there were no matches. This detail stops people every time I bring it up, and it's worth repeating because it's genuinely hard for a modern mind to absorb. The friction match wasn't invented until the 1820s, and even then it took decades to become something an ordinary household could reliably buy. For a family in 1755, starting fire from nothing meant flint, steel, and a bundle of dry tinder, bark shavings, dried moss, sometimes specially prepared scraps of charred cloth that would catch a spark and hold it. You struck the flint against the steel edge, threw sparks into the tinder and blew softly, patiently, hopping the tiny ember would take. Then you transferred that fragile flame to kindling, and if everything went right, you finally had something you could call a fire. On a dry summer morning with good materials and steady hands, an experienced woman might manage this in a matter of minutes. On a damp winter morning with tinder that had drawn moisture from the night air, with fingers stiffened by cold, with children crying for their breakfast, it could take far longer. Sometimes it simply failed. This is why, every single night before the household went to bed, someone performed a small ritual with a specific name attached to it. They banked the fire, not put it out, banked it. The live embers were raked together into a careful mound at the center of the hearth, then buried under a thick layer of ash, which acted as an insulating blanket, slowing the burn nearly to nothing while keeping a core of living coal alive underneath. Some households used a specific tool for this, a domed metal cover, often called a fire hood or curfew, placed directly over the banked coals to shield them from stray drafts overnight. The word itself traces back to an old French phrase meaning roughly cover the fire, which is a small linguistic fossil of just how central this nightly ritual once was. Every morning, before anything else happened in that house, before children were roused, before breakfast was so much as considered, the woman of the house went straight to the hearth. She lifted the cover aside. She dug through the ash to find the buried ember. She coaxed it back to life using a bellows, that simple leather and wood device built to push a focused stream of air across dying coals. And if the ember was still alive under there, it caught. The fire returned. Only then could the day properly begin. There's a wonderful first-hand account from a woman named Abigail Foote, a Connecticut farm wife who kept a diary in the 1770s, describing her days in the same clipped, exhausted shorthand so many colonial women used: carding wool, fetching water, did washing, hung out and dried the same, and buried somewhere in nearly every entry without comment the fire she must have tended to make any of it possible. It didn't need explaining. It was simply what a day required. Let me walk you through what a colonial woman actually needed to know about fire, because this is where I think most people are genuinely surprised. Running a hearth kitchen wasn't just a matter of keep the wood burning. It was a form of applied science, learned entirely without formal schooling, passed from mother to daughter through years of watching and doing. Different woods behaved completely differently, and knowing which to use for which purpose was essential practical knowledge. Hardwoods, oak, maple. Hickory burned hot and long, producing the dense, stable coal bed ideal for a stew that needed to simmer through an entire afternoon. Softwoods like pine caught fast and burned bright, useful for getting a new fire going quickly, but left behind a weak, short-lived coal bed unsuited to slow cooking. Applewood and other fruit woods were prized for the faint sweetness they lent to roasting meat. Green wood, freshly cut, still full of sap and moisture, was nearly useless, producing more smoke and hissing steam than usable heat, which is exactly why wood had to be split and left to season for months before anyone would trust it near a cooking fire. The colonial cook also managed something like separate burners, not dials on a stove but literal physical arrangements of coals across the hearthstone. She might rake a mound of embers to one side for high, searing heat, and spread a thin layer elsewhere for a slow, gentle simmer. She could nestle a heavy cast iron pot squat, thick-walled, with a flanged lid built to hold its own layer of coals on top, directly into the embers, creating something close to a true oven baking bread or a pie from below and above at once. She could suspend meat on a spit between iron supports, or hang a kettle from a swinging iron arm bolted into the chimney's inner wall, letting her pull a pot toward the room to check its progress without ever having to reach into the flames themselves. None of this came with dials or thermometers or timers. She knew bread was ready by the hollow sound it made when tapped. She knew a stew had reached the right thickness by how it resisted a wooden spoon. She knew simply because she had done this hundreds of times before, and her instincts had been built one repetition at a time. I want to be honest with you about something here. Reading accounts of what these women managed, alone in one room with nothing but fire and hard-won instinct, day after day after day, I feel something close to genuine awe. Not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind that quietly rearranges what you thought competence looked like. There's another layer to the hearth that's easy to overlook if you only think about the practical side of cooking and heat. The fire was also the only light in the room. On a winter evening, and in New England, full dark could arrive as early as 4:30 in the afternoon come December. The only illumination inside that single room came from the fire. Candles supplemented it, yes, but candles cost money and burned quickly, and most families rationed them with real care. The fire, by contrast, was already burning anyway. Its light was substantial. If you've never sat in a room lit by nothing but firelight, truly nothing else, no phone glow, no street light leaking under a curtain, you'd likely be surprised by how bright a well-tended fire actually is. It throws long, shifting shadows. It lights the center of a room in warm gold and lets the edges dissolve into dark. Families arranged their whole evening around this one light source, the way we might arrange furniture around a television today. The seat nearest the hearth was the most desirable, warmest, and best lit, and by common understanding in most households, that seat belonged to the mother, since she'd be the one sewing or mending by its glow long after supper was cleared. The father might sit nearby with a pipe and an almanac, Poor Richard's, most likely, if the family could get hold of a copy, since it was read for its weather predictions, planting advice, and its little scattered proverbs almost as much as anything else printed in the colonies. Children clustered at the fire's outer edge, trading quiet stories in low voices, close enough to the warmth to matter, far enough to stay out of the way. I want to ask you something, honestly. When was the last time you sat near something warm and real and simply let it hold the room for a while? No screen, no speaker playing something in the background, just light and heat you didn't summon with a switch. There's something in that specific experience, fire as the actual center of an evening, that I think we've quietly lost without fully noticing we lost it. This family didn't choose the fire for its atmosphere. They had no alternative. But they got something from that lack of choice that we've spent a small fortune trying to recreate ever since, with scented candles and fireplace videos and white noise machines built to sound like crackling wood. The fire pulled every body in the house into one circle. It drew a line between the lit, held world inside and the vast dark world outside. And in that narrow ring of warmth, something like family life took shape, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the physics of fire left them no other option. By late evening, the room settled into its own equilibrium. The fire had eased down from its cooking height into a slower, gentler glow. The heavy pots had been lifted off the crane and set to the side. The iron tools, tongs, poker, long-handled fork, leaned against the hearthstone where they'd wait for morning. The smell in the room now was wood smoke, cooked food, and the faint animal warmth of wool clothing drying near the heat. Outside, the wind pressed steadily against the walls, and sometime in that last hour before sleep, the mother, almost always the mother, performed one final careful act. She raked the embers together. She buried them under a fresh layer of ash. She set the cover in place. She made certain the fire would survive until morning, because if it didn't, the next day would start harder than it needed to. And in this world, mornings were already hard enough on their own. What happened in that room after the fire was banked low, what this family actually ate that evening, who sat where at the table, who was allowed to speak, and who was expected to stay quiet, that is the story waiting for us next. And I think the supper table of a family like this one will surprise you in ways you're not quite expecting. Here's something I want you to try right now. Close your eyes for just 5 seconds and picture a family sitting down to dinner in the 1700s. Go on, really picture it. I'd bet you saw a long wooden table, some kind of roasted bird, a few candles burning, maybe a pie cooling on a windowsill, pewter mugs, someone in a crisp apron, something golden and fragrant steaming in the center of the table. What you just imagined is a wealthy household. English gentry, or a prosperous colonial merchant family, at the very least, people with enough spare firewood, enough proper cookware, and enough meat on hand to produce a meal that looks like that. And if we're being completely honest, that image describes maybe one household in 10 across colonial America. For the other 9, the evening meal looked like something else entirely. And honestly, I think it's a far more interesting story. Let's start with the single detail that modern people find hardest to absorb. There was no such thing as dinner as the big event of the evening. We're so conditioned to think of the evening meal as the main event, the one the whole day builds toward, that it takes real mental effort to accept that for most people in colonial America, the largest, most substantial meal of the day was eaten around noon, not 6 or 7 in the evening. This midday meal, confusingly, was the one they called dinner. It happened once the morning's heaviest labor was done, and the body needed real fuel before the afternoon's work resumed. This was when the bulk of the day's actual cooking effort went: the pot of beans that had been simmering since sunrise, a portion of salt pork if the household had any to spare, served alongside cornbread or a thick pudding, because the body needed those calories now, not at sundown. The evening meal had its own separate name: supper. And supper, for an ordinary family, was a modest, quiet affair. Often it wasn't cooked fresh at all. Food historians reconstructing colonial meals from surviving household accounts and diaries describe supper as typically a smaller echo of breakfast: bread, cheese, a bowl of mush, or simply whatever remained from the noon meal, warmed over the coals. Read that again slowly, because I think it's one of those details that sounds simple until you actually sit with it: bread, cheese, mush, or leftovers. There was no real concept of waste here. Whatever hadn't been finished at noon was carefully covered and kept near the cooling embers, then reheated or eaten cold come evening. The bean pot from midday reappeared at supper. The corn porridge left simmering on the trivet all afternoon got ladled out again into wooden bowls. Winter actually worked in the family's favor here. Food kept reasonably well against cold stone walls and in root cellars. Summer was harder since everything had to move faster before the heat turned it. And here's the detail that I think reveals the most about this whole way of living. Nobody experienced this as deprivation. This was simply Tuesday. This was how meals fit into the rhythm of a body that had been working since before sunrise and would need to be in bed not long after the light failed. You ate what there was. You ate it when your body needed it, and then you carried on. Now let's actually talk about what filled those pots, because this is where things get genuinely interesting. The single most common ingredient in an ordinary colonial diet was pork, specifically salt pork. Not fresh meat most of the year, but pork that had been packed in brine or heavily salted during the autumn slaughter and stored in barrels to last through the cold months. It wasn't elegant, but it was remarkably functional. It was cheap to produce on a farm that already kept pigs. It lasted for months without spoiling if properly cured. It added fat and flavor to almost anything it touched, and nearly every rural household kept at least one hog specifically for this purpose. Salt pork went into the bean pot. It flavored the porridge. A thin slice fried in its own rendered fat in a shallow, long-legged pan set right in the embers could turn the plainest meal into something that actually tasted like something. One physician writing decades later in the early 1800s remarked, somewhat unkindly, but not entirely inaccurately, that the ordinary American diet leaned so heavily on pork that the young republic might fairly be nicknamed a nation built on salt and swine. He was exaggerating for effect, but not by a wide margin. Corn was the other pillar of the colonial table, not the sweet corn we picture piled at a summer farmer's market today, but dried field corn, ground into meal, which functioned as the daily bread of most ordinary households. Cornmeal became hasty pudding, sometimes called Indian pudding, simply cornmeal boiled slowly in water or milk into a thick, warm porridge. It appeared in printed cookbooks of the era described plainly as cheap and perfectly acceptable fare, which tells you a great deal about how humbly this food was regarded even as it fed families up and down the social ladder, eaten by prosperous merchant households and subsistence farmers alike. It was, in its way, the great equalizer of the colonial kitchen. Cornmeal also produced Johnny cakes, thin, flat cakes of cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt, sometimes an egg if the hens had been generous that day, cooked directly on a smooth board propped near the fire, or right on a heated stone at the edge of the hearth. No pan required, just heat, patience, and a cook who could judge doneness by color, and by the faint sound the cake made when tapped with a finger. I want to pause on something I find quietly moving about this food. We live in an age of extraordinary culinary abundance. Most people can walk into a grocery store and find ingredients drawn from a dozen different countries, preserved through methods that would have looked like pure sorcery to a colonial housewife. We've mostly forgotten what it feels like to cook inside genuine limits, only what grew that season, only what survived the preserving process, only what was actually in the house. This family did not have the luxury we take for granted. And yet the food coming out of that hearth wasn't joyless. Families looked forward to meals. Children remembered decades later the particular smell of a certain pot on a certain evening. Seasonal treats, the first spring greens, the pressed cider of autumn, fish pulled fresh from a nearby stream, were genuinely exciting precisely because they didn't last. There's something about real constraint that seems to sharpen appreciation, and I think about that sometimes when I'm standing in front of a refrigerator stocked with 100 options and somehow can't decide what I actually want. Now let's bring you to the table itself, because the physical experience of eating in this period was different from ours in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes genuinely surprising. Most ordinary families in this period did not own individual plates for every person at the table. Meals were often eaten from trenchers, carved wooden dishes, square or oblong, with a shallow hollow scooped into the surface. And here's the detail that tends to catch people off guard. Trenchers were routinely shared. 2 people to a single trencher was completely standard. Husband and wife, siblings, sometimes even a guest sharing with a stranger if space ran tight. There's a documented account of a New England church deacon who drew open disapproval from his neighbors for the offense of having enough individual trenchers that each of his own children could eat from their own dish. It was considered showy, excessive, the kind of display that plain, sensible people simply didn't indulge in. Sit with that for a second. Individual plates for your own children, viewed as an extravagance. Forks were genuinely rare in ordinary homes through most of the century. One of the earliest documented forks in colonial New England belonged to a colonial governor in the 1630s, and he was, notably, the governor. For everyone else, the standard eating tools were a knife, a wooden spoon, and very often simply your hands. Napkins weren't a mark of formal manners so much as a practical necessity, since fingers did most of the work at an ordinary table. The drink at supper in most households was not water, and this detail stops modern listeners cold every time. Well water and stream water in this period was often genuinely unsafe, contaminated by runoff, by proximity to livestock pens and outhouses. Colonists weren't being paranoid, they were being reasonably cautious. Instead, households drank what they'd known back in England: hard cider, small beer, and for wealthier families, tea. Hard cider pressed from apples was, in effect, the everyday working drink of the American colonies, the way beer was in England: cheap, widely available, and crucially, safer than water, since the fermentation process killed off the bacteria that made raw water risky. Even children were given watered-down cider or very weak small beer with ordinary meals, and this wasn't seen as reckless. By the standards of the time, it was simply sensible. It's worth noting how much this varied depending on where in the colonies a family lived. Along the New England coast, salted or fresh cod might anchor the evening meal depending on the season, and shellfish were so abundant in some areas that lobster was considered practically a nuisance food. Some labor agreements of the period actually included clauses limiting how many times a week an employer could serve it to servants and apprentices, which tells you everything about how dramatically scarcity or abundance can reshape what counts as a delicacy. In the middle colonies, German immigrant families brought traditions of slow-cooked one-pot stews that folded into the regional cooking of Pennsylvania and New York. In the southern colonies, the culinary legacy of enslaved cooks, who carried with them deep knowledge of okra, black-eyed peas, sweet potatoes, and sesame, reshaped Southern food in ways still visible on American tables today, a legacy inseparable from the deeply troubling history that produced it. Let's return one more time to that ordinary supper table, because I want you to feel this rather than simply understand it as fact. It's evening. The light is low. The fire has settled from its cooking height into a slower burn. The children are seated, some of the smallest actually standing at the edge of the table, since there might not be enough bench space for everyone, and it was considered entirely acceptable for a child to stand and simply take whatever was handed to them without complaint. The shared trencher between two people holds warm, hasty pudding. There's a broken heel of cornbread passed hand to hand. Perhaps a soft scrap of salt pork left from the noon pot. A wooden tankard of cider makes its way around the table. Nobody is fussing over preference. Nobody is asking what anyone feels like eating tonight. You eat what's there, because what's there is what there is. And here's what strikes me every time I sit with this. There was almost no food waste in a household like this one. Not out of some abstract virtue, but because waste was a luxury nobody at that table could afford. Every scrap of rendered fat went toward cooking or candle making. Every bone went into the broth pot. Stale bread got soaked and repurposed rather than thrown out. In the earliest colonial period, the trencher itself had sometimes literally been a thick slab of stale bread, eaten afterward or tossed to the animals once the meal was done. We could spend a long time cataloging everything this life lacked compared to ours. But sitting with this particular meal for a moment, I find myself noticing what it had instead: simplicity, efficiency, a complete absence of the low hum of modern anxiety around food. The calorie counting, the dietary categories, the paralysis of too many choices. They knew exactly what they were eating and exactly where it came from, because in almost every case they had grown it, raised it, or preserved it with their own hands. The meal is ending now. The trenchers have been scraped clean. The cider tankard has made its last round. Outside, night has fully settled in. Inside, the fire has dropped to a comfortable glow, and the room holds that particular warmth only a hearth produces, hot at the center, cooler toward the walls, with a ring of amber light drawing the whole family in close. And now something is about to happen at that table that will tell you far more about how this family actually functioned than the food ever could. The question of who sat where. Who was permitted to speak and who was expected to stay silent. Who was served first and who waited their turn. What the rules actually were, who enforced them, and what it cost you to break one. You know, that thing that happens at Thanksgiving or any big enough family gathering, where the kids end up exiled to a wobbly folding table in the corner, half in the hallway, sometimes with mismatched chairs. We call it the kids' table, always with a little affectionate cruelty, and eventually, getting promoted to the adult table becomes this quiet, unspoken rite of passage, proof you've finally arrived. That tradition didn't come from nowhere. It has deep roots, and once you understand where those roots actually reach, the supper table of an ordinary 18th century family starts to look far more complicated than simply a place where people happen to eat. Let's begin at the head of the table, because everything else radiates outward from that single seat. The father sat there, not out of some pleasant custom, but because in the eyes of both colonial law and colonial religious teaching, he was, quite literally, the household's governing authority. Ministers of the period frequently described the family as a small mirror of the wider commonwealth. The father ruled the household the way magistrates ruled the colony, and the way God, in their theology, ruled all things. The family was understood as a tiny governed state, and the father was its appointed head. This was not an abstraction under colonial law. A married woman held what was called coverture status. Her legal identity was folded entirely into her husband's upon marriage. She generally could not independently own property, could not draft a binding will of her own, could not sign contracts, could not stand as a legal witness in most courts. None of this struck the people living inside it as unusually harsh. It was simply the framework they'd inherited, confirmed by law, reinforced by church teaching, unquestioned by daily habit. A wife who openly contradicted her husband at the table wasn't just being impolite. She was pushing against a moral order her entire community took seriously, and one her church would not hesitate to address if it became a pattern. So where did the wife sit? At the opposite end of the table, facing her husband directly. This wasn't accidental. The seating mirrored the shape of the household itself, authority radiating from one end. Household management, serving, portioning, quietly watching which child needed more and which had had enough, anchored at the other. Along the sides sat the children, arranged roughly by age, the oldest nearest the parents, the youngest further down. In households wealthy enough to keep a servant or hired hand who ate alongside the family, quite common, since fully separate servants' quarters were a luxury most colonial families couldn't afford. That servant sat at the very lowest position, furthest from the head, at the outer edge of the household's circle of belonging. And here's where something we mentioned earlier connects back in a way I find genuinely striking. The salt cellar sitting at the center of that table wasn't merely a container of seasoning. It carried real social weight, a tradition inherited from medieval Europe. Guests and family members seated above the salt, nearer the head of the table, held higher standing. Those seated below the salt, on the far side of the cellar from the host, were understood to rank lower: children, servants, guests of lesser importance. This distinction was taken seriously enough that at least one early American college is recorded as having used a large ceremonial salt vessel on its dining hall table, specifically to mark the line between faculty and students. Think about that for a moment, an institution built to train ministers and scholars, using a salt dish to quietly announce who mattered more in the room. The phrase "below the salt" survives in English today as an expression for social inferiority, even though almost nobody using it now knows where it actually came from. Now let's talk about the children, because I think this is the part of the colonial table that lands hardest on a modern parent's ear. Children did not sit down whenever they felt like it. They did not reach for food the moment they were hungry. They did not speak unless spoken to first. Conduct manuals circulated widely through the colonies laying out precisely how a well-raised child was expected to behave at table, and reading them now feels almost like reading a list of everything a modern parent actively encourages a child to do instead. Sit only once you are bidden. Do not speak while your elders are in conversation. Do not stare at anyone seated above you at the table. Keep your hands and your voice still until you are addressed. And then there's the detail that stopped me cold the first time I came across it, in documented practice across a number of New England and Mid-Atlantic households, not just in the pages of etiquette books, but in actual daily custom. In some families, children were not permitted to sit at the table at all, even after the blessing had been said. They stood through the entire meal, waiting to be handed whatever was offered, eating what they were given without ever asking for anything different. One writer documenting colonial domestic customs described it plainly. In some homes, children stood the whole meal through, sometimes with their own small trencher balanced in hand, sometimes simply waiting behind the seated adults to receive whatever was passed back to them. I want to be honest about my own reaction to this, because I think it's worth nomming. My first instinct, encountering this, was to judge it fairly harshly. Silent, standing children sounds, through a modern lens close to unkindness. But the deeper I've read into what these families actually believed, the clearer it becomes that cruelty wasn't the intention. Formation was. They genuinely believed a child raised to wait patiently, speak only when appropriate, and accept what was given without protest would grow into an adult of real character and self-command. The dinner table wasn't only where you ate. It was where you practiced becoming a particular kind of person, whether we agree with that philosophy or not. And I'll admit I don't entirely. I think it deserves to be understood on its own terms before we simply write it off. There's one more dimension to this table I want to sit with, because I think it says more about this family's values than almost anything else we've covered so far: the blessing. No meal in a household like this one began without prayer, and not the 3-second, half-mumbled grace many of us are used to today. A real prayer, sometimes lengthy, sometimes including a passage of scripture, almost always spoken by the Father himself, since leading the household's spiritual life was understood as squarely his responsibility. Young men of the period were often raised on printed lists of behavioral rules, some borrowed and adapted from older European courtesy traditions, that covered everything from table manners: don't scratch, don't cough loudly, don't reach across another person's plate, to the deeper expectations of a person of good character. A young George Washington, as a teenager, is known to have hand-copied out over 100 such rules of civility for his own use, and there's good reason to believe he took them seriously enough to actually try living by them for the rest of his life. What this reveals, I think, is a world in which the dinner table was never really casual, even in its plainness. It was formal in its own quiet way. It was where the household's values got enacted rather than merely discussed, where a father's authority showed itself in who he served first and how he spoke, where a wife's competence was visible in the smoothness of the meal and the quality of what reached the table, where children either demonstrated or failed to demonstrate that the lessons drilled into them were actually taking hold. I want to ask you something honestly, and I'd genuinely like you to sit with it for a moment. The next time you share a meal with people you love, what is that table actually doing beneath the surface? What roles are being performed, even without anyone nomming them out loud? Who talks the most? Who quietly manages the logistics nobody else notices? Who holds authority at that table, and where did it come from? I don't ask this because I think the 18th century had it right clearly. Aspects of this world deserve to be left behind. But I do think these people understood something we've grown a little too casual about, that a table and the small rituals built around it can be a place where the truest things about a family become visible, where values get passed down without ever being spoken aloud. They took that seriously, maybe too seriously in places. But there's something in that seriousness worth noticing. Let me bring you back into the room one final time tonight. The meal has ended. The trenchers have been wiped and stacked. The children have settled into quiet. The father has finished speaking, and the evening prayer is still to come before anyone heads to bed. And as the table is cleared, as the tankard is set aside and the fire is banked a little lower for the night, the woman of this house is still working. She has been working since well before dawn. She has at least another hour left in her yet. And the nature of that labor, the invisible, relentless, entirely unglamorous work of a colonial woman, once the table has been cleared and the children begin drifting towards sleep, is a story almost nobody thought to write down at the time, which is exactly why it deserves telling now. There's an old saying, so old that most people have long forgotten where it came from. A man labors from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. It sounds at first like something muttered under a tired breath. But trace it back far enough and it stops sounding like a complaint and starts sounding like an accurate description of an entire economic system, one so deeply woven into daily life that most of the women living inside it didn't even have the vocabulary to name what was happening to them. They simply kept working, and nowhere does this become clearer than in the hours after dark, once the rest of the household has finally gone quiet. Let's set the scene properly, because the details matter. Supper has been eaten. The table has been cleared. The children have been sent toward the loft, some willingly, most with the ordinary resistance children have always shown at bedtime. The father has settled somewhere near the fire, perhaps reading if the household owns a book or two, perhaps simply resting after a day of physical labor that has genuinely worn him out. The fire has been banked down to conserve fuel through the night, and the mother is still moving. She's at the spinning wheel if this household produces its own thread, which most rural households of this period did. The wheel makes a low, steady hum, a sound she's likely stopped consciously hearing at all, the way you stop noticing rain once it's been falling for hours. She draws fiber with both hands, stepping backward and forward in a rhythm so practiced it's become almost unconscious. Or she's at a loom if the household is a little further along, the clatter of the shuttle passing through the warped threads, the steady beat of the reed pressing each new row into place. Not quiet work, but necessary work, and necessary at night, because there simply weren't enough daylight hours to fit it in otherwise. Or she's mending. A stocking worn through at the heel, a collar frayed from weekly washing, a child's dress torn along a seam after catching on a fence rail. In this period, every scrap of cloth was valuable enough to repair rather than discard, and that repair work fell almost entirely onto the women of the household. I want to pause here and explain something about the economics of cloth in this era, because it completely reframes every hour of this nighttime labor. Fabric, the raw material behind every garment worn by every person in that house, was extraordinarily expensive relative to what an ordinary family actually earned. Not expensive in the sense of a luxury item. Expensive in the sense that a basic necessity becomes expensive when there's no machine anywhere to produce it quickly. Before industrial textile mills reshaped the market in the early 1800s, producing woven cloth required a staggering amount of human time from start to finish. Sheep had to be sheared. Wool had to be washed and carded by hand. It had to be spun into usable thread on a wheel, a process demanding hours of standing and walking for every single pound of yarn produced. That yarn then had to be woven into cloth on a loom, itself a physically demanding, technically exacting task. And finally, the finished cloth had to be cut and hand-sewn into an actual garment, since sewing machines didn't exist yet, and every stitch was placed one at a time. One historian studying this period estimated that producing a single new dress, starting from raw wool, could represent roughly 4 full weeks of a woman's labor. 4 weeks, for one dress. This is precisely why clothing was routinely named specifically in wills, why a good winter coat was patched and repatched for decades rather than replaced, why the mending basket in a household like this one never fully emptied, not from laziness, but from simple arithmetic. There were never enough daylight hours to finish everything that needed doing, so a portion of it always got pushed into the candle-lit evening, into hours that were technically supposed to be rest. Household surveys from the mid-1700s suggest that a large majority of rural New England homes owned a spinning wheel outright. This wasn't a hobby object tucked in a corner for decoration. It was infrastructure, every bit as essential to a household's survival as the plow in the barn or the cow in the pen. Of all the ordinary colonial women whose evening labor has survived for us to actually read, there's one name worth speaking here directly, because she left behind something almost no other ordinary woman of her time did: a detailed, daily written record. Her name was Martha Ballard, a midwife who lived and worked in Hallowell, in what is now Maine. Beginning in 1785, at the age of 50, she kept a diary every single day for the next 27 years, until her death in 1812. Martha Ballard was, by any reasonable measure, one of the busiest women in colonial New England. Over the course of her diary, she recorded delivering more than 800 bobbies. She made her own medicines from herbs she grew and gathered herself. She crossed rivers by canoe in complete darkness, rode through blizzards, waded through spring mud to reach women in labor on the far side of the river. She was called from her own bed in the dead of night so routinely that the phrase, "called at midnight," appears throughout her entries with the same flat tone someone might use to note the weather. And then, after all of that, she came home and she spun. Her diary records this without any drama at all, without complaint, without any apparent sense that the juxtaposition was remarkable in the slightest. She might return from attending a difficult birth in the small hours of the morning, sleep briefly, and then note in that same day's entry that she'd spun several skeins of linen thread before nightfall. One entry records her finishing a set of her husband's stockings well past 9 at night. Another notes she'd baked through the evening and then sat up further still with her needlework before finally going to bed. For a long time, scholars largely dismissed Martha Ballard's diary as too repetitive and too ordinary to be worth serious study. It took the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who spent nearly a decade researching Ballard's life before publishing her Pulitzer Prize-winning account of it, to point out that the diary had been overlooked for precisely the reason it mattered most: its exhausting, unbroken, day-after-day sameness. The relentless rhythm of domestic labor, recorded without any self-pity and without any sense of accomplishment attached to it, was so unremarkable to the men who first read it that they simply couldn't see what it actually was: a complete portrait of a world in which women's labor held everything together and was credited with almost nothing. There's a question I keep returning to when I think about those long evening hours. Was she lonely? Not lonely in the dramatic sense, not isolated, not abandoned. Lonely in the quieter sense of doing work that no one was watching, work that would leave behind no visible trace once it was done. The stocking finished at nearly 10 at night would be worn and worn again, and eventually worn through to nothing. The thread spun by candlelight would become cloth, which would become a shirt, which would eventually become a rag, and then nothing at all. None of that labor was ever counted on any ledger. Census records from this period, when they bothered to record rural women's occupations at all, routinely listed them as simply not employed, despite the spinning wheels, the looms, the medicinal gardens, the food preservation, the candle making, the endless mending. I find this one of the more quietly devastating facts buried in the domestic history of this period. Not all of this evening labor happened in isolation, though, and this matters, because it reveals something important about how women in this world found both community and a measure of sanity inside all that unrelenting work. The quilting bee is probably the most famous example, but it was really just one form of something historians sometimes call a work frolic, a gathering where neighbors came together to accomplish a shared domestic task, and turned it, through sheer collective will, into something that genuinely resembled a celebration. Women would carry their spinning to a neighbor's house of an evening, and what might otherwise have been a solitary hour at the wheel became, instead, an hour of conversation, gossip, shared remedies, and the kind of practical knowledge women passed hand to hand because nobody else was ever going to write it down for them. These gatherings weren't incidental to colonial women's lives. They were structurally important, the mechanism by which knowledge traveled between households, by which emotional support was quietly exchanged, by which the isolation of a single farmhouse was, for a few hours at least, dissolved. When the gathering ended and each woman walked home through the dark, candle or lantern in hand, following a path she knew by feel more than by sight, she walked back into her own house, her own banked fire, her own unfinished pile of work waiting. Here's what strikes me most, and I want to say it plainly before we move on. The women living through evenings like this didn't consider themselves remarkable. They didn't write manifestos. Most, unlike Martha Ballard, never kept diaries at all. Most of her neighbors, women working every bit as hard, spinning just as much thread, delivering just as many meals, mending just as many torn garments by the same failing candlelight, are almost entirely invisible to history now. They lived full lives, difficult lives, lives built on genuine competence and endurance, and they left behind almost no trace of any of it. When they died, the record often said little more than wife of, followed by their husband's name. I think about this sometimes when I hear people speak casually about simpler times, as though the past were restful, as though evenings in a household like this one were gentle and uncomplicated. They weren't. They were full of labor the people doing it considered too ordinary to remark on, too necessary to complain about, too essential to ever stop. The spinning wheel hums on. The candle burns a little lower. The woman at the wheel keeps drawing thread. And somewhere in that house, in the far corner, on a straw mattress under a quilt she likely stitched herself, the children are sleeping, or rather, they're supposed to be sleeping. Because if you've ever put a child to bed in a house with no electric light, no glowing screen to look at, no white noise machine humming in the corner, and no real certainty about what might be lurking beyond the window, you already know that supposed to be asleep and actually asleep are two very different things. Think back for a moment to the last bedtime story you ever heard as a child, or if you're a parent, the last one you told. Chances are it involved some kind of danger. A wolf, a witch, a shadow in the woods, but the danger was always safely contained. The story resolved. The child made it home. The monster was defeated or revealed to be nothing at all. Order was restored and you could close your eyes knowing everything was, in fact, fine. That's what we expect from a bedtime story now: comfort, containment, the quiet reassurance that the dark holds nothing real. The children in the household we've been sitting with tonight expected something quite different, and the stories told to them, on the night stories were told at all, reflected a world where darkness wasn't a literary device. It was simply the dark, and what might live inside it was not always assumed to be make-believe. Let's start with bedtime itself, because even this small nightly ritual was shaped by a worldview we've largely set aside. In much of Puritan New England, which set the cultural tone for a great deal of colonial family life through this whole century, children were not considered innocent by nature. They were considered born into sin, creatures whose natural inclinations needed to be brought under discipline before that inborn wickedness could take permanent root. This sounds harsh to modern ears, and by our standards it is. But it wasn't experienced as cruelty by the people who believed it. It was experienced as love. Saving a child's soul was, in this framework, the single most important thing a parent could do for them. So the bedtime prayer was never a soft, optional little ritual. It was understood as something closer to spiritual armor. Generations of colonial children were taught some version of a simple rhymed prayer asking God to keep their soul through the night, and quite explicitly, to take it up to Him should the child happen to die before morning. Sit with that phrase for a second. Should I die before I wake? This kind of language appeared in the most widely used primers and school books of the era, printed alongside alphabet rhymes that casually reminded children of their own mortality as a matter of course. We've softened bedtime enormously since then. But I want to be careful here, because I don't think this reflects simple cruelty on the part of colonial parents, or at least, not most of them, most of the time. What they were doing was more complicated than that. They were preparing their children for a reality that was, in fact, genuinely dangerous. Childhood mortality in this period was staggering by any modern measure. Some New England communities recorded child death rates as high as 30% before the age of 5 in particular decades. Funerals for children were held in the same rooms where those children had recently been playing. Older siblings routinely watched younger siblings die. A child in this world didn't need to be told that death was possible before they understood mourning firsthand. Many had already seen it. The prayer, "Should I die before I wake," wasn't designed to frighten a child. It was designed to comfort, to hand a child a framework for a possibility that couldn't honestly be hidden from them. To say, if the worst happens tonight, your soul is held. You are not alone in the dark. That is, even within a theology many of us today would find difficult, a genuinely tender thing. Alongside the strictly religious, there was also the folkloric, and this is where a colonial child's evening gets interesting in a different way entirely. This wasn't yet an age of confident, settled rationalism for most ordinary people. The scientific and philosophical ideas of the wider Enlightenment were unfolding across Europe, certainly, but they traveled slowly out to the farms and small towns of colonial America, and when they did arrive, they sat uneasily alongside beliefs inherited from England, Scotland, and the broader Protestant tradition of Northern Europe, beliefs that had, often unconsciously, absorbed pieces of the land's older folk knowledge along the way, which is to say, people genuinely believed in things. Not as quaint cultural shorthand, but as real possibilities. They believed in the potential presence of spirits, providential signs, unexplained disturbances that ordinary causes couldn't account for. Historians who have studied the everyday mental world of ordinary colonists describe a universe saturated with what contemporaries themselves called wonders, events breaking the expected order of nature and demanding some explanation beyond the natural. Comets, sudden unexplained deaths, strange sounds in a house at night, animals behaving oddly for no discernible reason, a fire that guttered out with no apparent cause. At least one prominent New England minister of the previous generation had published an entire collection of documented illustrious providences, strange occurrences reported by reliable witnesses, apparitions, unexplained deliverances, houses disturbed by unseen forces. This wasn't published as entertainment. It was published as theology. The supernatural was expected as part of the fabric of ordinary life. The only real question was what any given occurrence meant. So what did a colonial child actually hear from the adults around them about the night? They heard that the forest beyond the cleared farmland was genuinely dangerous, not only in the practical sense of wolves and bitter cold, but in an older sense too, the sense that things moved through it after dark that had no name in any language the church recognized. The wilderness in this period wasn't romantic. It was the direct opposite of order, of civilization, of safety. And for many families, it was understood as the place where the devil, quite literally, held particular sway. Children heard stories passed neighbor to neighbor of figures seen standing at the foot of someone's bed in the dead of night, of strange lights out in the marsh that seemed to follow travelers home and couldn't be explained away. These weren't told as idle entertainment. They circulated as something closer to news, reports from a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and grew thinnest precisely after dark. And then there's the question of what a colonial bedtime story actually sounded like, because we tend to assume bedtime stories have always been gentle, scaled down for young ears, softened of violence, guaranteed a safe ending. That assumption is a genuinely recent invention. The soothing, reassuring bedtime story as a distinct genre didn't really take shape until the late 1800s. Before that, for the entire colonial period and well beyond, what children heard at night were largely the same stories adults told each other, older folk tales that didn't sanitize death, didn't guarantee a happy ending, and made no attempt to shield a child from the knowledge that the world held real danger. Stories where a child wandered into the woods and sometimes didn't come back, where a bargain struck with a stranger carried consequences that outlasted a lifetime, where the lesson wasn't everything will be fine, but something closer to pay attention, because the world has sharp edges, and some of them are very close by. I want to be honest that I find something genuinely valuable in this, something our modern instinct toward gentleness may have quietly cost us. There's a long-standing argument, made by thinkers as different from one another as 20th century child psychologists and the oldest folk traditions themselves, that children actually need stories containing real darkness. That pretending nothing bad can ever happen doesn't prepare a child for a world where bad things sometimes do. That facing a shadow inside the safety of a story, nomming it, walking toward it, surviving it, is one of the ways children learn what courage actually feels like. A colonial child who recited, "Should I die before I wake," and then closed their eyes to sleep wasn't a traumatized child. They were a child who had been told something true and given a way to carry it. Whether or not we share the theology behind it, I think there's something in that exchange worth sitting with. Here's a question I want to ask you honestly. When you were a child, or when you watch children now, what's the fear that never quite leaves them at bedtime? Not the fear inside the story, the real one underneath it. For most children, in most times and places, it seems to come down to some version of the same thing. Not death, exactly, but separateness. That moment when the adult leaves the room, the door closes, and the child is left alone with the dark, with no guarantee at all of what that dark might hold. Colonial children had that same fear. But they also had something a great many modern children don't. An entire framework that explained the dark, gave it a name, and placed a guardian directly inside it. Not a nightlight, not a baby monitor humming quietly on a shelf. A God who was understood to hold your soul even while you slept, and a whole community that had already agreed, collectively, on what the dark meant, and how a person was meant to face it. Whether that framework was true is not a question I'm here to settle. But I don't think it was nothing. And I'm not entirely sure the loss of it has come free of any cost. By the time a child in this household finally drifted off, prayers said, catechism recited, the last embers of the fire throwing faint orange shapes up across the ceiling before fatting, they were falling asleep in a room that most modern people would find genuinely startling. Not simply because of the dark, not simply because of the cold, though that was real too, and we'll come to it, but because of who else was in that room. And who, quite literally, was sharing the bed beside them, the sleeping arrangements of a household in this period, who slept where. How many people shared a single bed, what a bedroom, even meant in this world, surprised the first modern historians who studied the records closely. I suspect it'll surprise you too. Let's begin with a question that sounds simple and turns out to be anything but. How many beds did an ordinary family in this period actually own? If you'd asked a farm wife in rural Massachusetts in the 1750s whether she felt her household was reasonably well provided for, and she'd smiled and said yes, what would that answer have actually meant, in terms of what her house physically contained? For most of us today, the question barely registers as a question at all. Every person in a household has a bed. Ideally, every child has their own room, or at least the expectation of one someday. That assumption sits so deep in how we think about home and comfort that we don't even notice it as an assumption. It's simply how things are. In this world, it wasn't how things were. Not remotely close. Historians who have studied the deep history of sleep in Western life have arrived at a genuinely striking conclusion. The idea of sleeping in a bed, in a sealed-off private room, entirely alone or with at most one other person, was not consistently in place anywhere in Europe or North America before roughly 1800. Not one piece of that arrangement. Your own private bedroom, the space you likely take completely for granted, the room you think of as your most personal refuge, is, in the sweep of human history, a remarkably recent invention. Start with the bed itself, because this is where the real story begins, and where most people's assumptions go wrong first. In a reasonably prosperous household of this era, the finest bed in the house was not tucked away in some private back room. It was displayed. Wealthier families across the colonies commonly kept their best bed in the parlor, the room where guests were received, fully dressed in its curtains and hangings, bolsters arranged just so, coverlets smoothed flat, a direct physical statement of the household standing in the world. Beds were valuable enough to be named explicitly in wills, passed down from parents to children as genuine inheritance. A fully dressed four-poster bed, complete with curtains and proper bedding, could represent something close to half the total value of everything an ordinary, non-wealthy family owned. There's a documented probate record from the previous century of a modestly prosperous man whose entire house was appraised at roughly £8, and whose feather bed and bedding alone were valued at almost exactly the same amount. His bed was worth as much as his house. Sit with that for a moment. The colonial bed wasn't only somewhere to sleep. It was a financial asset, a status symbol, a family heirloom, and in a great many households, the single most complex piece of equipment in the room. The wooden bed frame rested on a lattice of interwoven ropes or leather strapping stretched taut between the rails, forming the platform beneath layered mattresses. At the bottom, a firm tick stuffed with corn husks, straw, or horsehair. Above that, the true feather bed, dense, enveloping, sometimes packed with something like 80 or 90 pounds of goose down, heavy enough that climbing into it felt less like lying on a surface and more like being folded into warmth. Bolsters and pillows finished the arrangement. Nothing about this resembled our modern mattress. It was closer to sinking into something alive. And those supporting ropes loosened gradually over time, needing to be periodically retightened to keep the whole structure from sagging, which is, incidentally, the actual origin of the old phrase, sleep tight. Now, who actually slept where? In a typical farmhouse of this kind, the parents occupied the best bed in the house, and that arrangement was fixed and entirely unquestioned, as natural and unremarkable as the father's seat at the head of the supper table. Tucked beneath that main bedstead, on a low wooden frame fitted with small wheels so it could be rolled out at night and pushed back under during the day, slept the youngest child, on what households called a trundle bed. When a new baby arrived, the toddler who'd been in the trundle typically graduated up to sharing space with an older sibling, and the older children found space wherever the house allowed, in the loft above the main room if there was one, on a coarse straw-filled sack laid directly on the floor in a corner of the hall, on a bench near the hearth that folded flat into a sleeping surface at night. Wherever there was room, because room was the variable governing everything. In a modest single-room farmhouse of perhaps 18 or 20 feet across, roughly the footprint of a generous modern living room, it wasn't unusual for 8 or 10 people to sleep under one roof each night. The room didn't transform into a bedroom after dark. It remained the same room where the family had cooked, eaten, and worked all day. The bed was simply the one piece of furniture that converted the space into sleeping quarters once the candle went out. Servants, where a household had them, generally slept in the least comfortable spots the house had to offer, an unfinished attic space in colder regions, occasionally at the foot of the master's own bed, a custom inherited directly from English tradition, with the thinnest bedding the household had on hand. Through a full New England winter, a servant sleeping in an unheated attic space made do with whatever covering they'd been given, and nothing more. The same hierarchy so visible at the supper table simply carried straight through into the dark hours without interruption. And then there's the matter of strangers, which I think is the detail that genuinely surprises people most. In this world, sharing a bed with someone you had never met before was entirely normal, not merely tolerated, but socially expected as a basic part of hospitality. Roadside inns routinely put 2, 3, or more travelers into the same bed as a matter of ordinary course. In rural areas, a traveler arriving late at a farmhouse and offered a place to sleep for the night would often find that the available space was simply a portion of a bed someone else was already occupying. Objecting, or even visibly showing displeasure about it, was considered, in the language of the time, deeply bad manners, something close to fastidiousness for its own sake. Etiquette guides of the period actually offered specific instruction on how to share a bed gracefully with a stranger. Lie still, keep to your own side, don't monopolize the blankets. There's a well-documented episode from September of 1776, in which 2 of the men who had just helped draft the Declaration of Independence found themselves forced to share a single bed at a crowded New Jersey inn. One wanted the window shut tight against the night air. The other held strong, well-developed opinions about the health benefits of fresh air, and reportedly continued arguing his case at some length while they lay there together in the dark. The window, by most accounts, stayed open. History is, every so often, genuinely funny. Now let's talk about bundling, because it may be the single most misunderstood sleeping custom to come out of this whole period. Bundling was a supervised courtship practice, especially common among Dutch and Welsh immigrant communities in the northeastern colonies, and it spread more widely from there. When a young man traveled to call on a young woman he was courting, he might, with the full knowledge and consent of her parents, be permitted to spend part of the night in bed beside her, fully clothed, each wrapped in their own separate blankets, sometimes with a long wooden board laid lengthwise down the middle of the bed specifically to keep them apart. In some communities, the young woman was even sewn snugly into a fitted cloth sack from the waist down for the same purpose. The reasoning behind it was almost entirely practical. A young suitor might have walked or ridden several hours to make his visit. Candles were far too precious to burn away an entire evening on courtship alone, and sending him back out into total winter darkness afterward carried genuine risk. It made more sense, by the logic of the time, to let him stay the night under close and constant supervision, parents in the very same room, or the next one over, listening for any sound, than to risk the alternative of a young couple wandering off alone outdoors after dark. Ministers of the period railed against the practice from the pulpit with real vigor. Moralists published pamphlets against it. And church records from communities where bundling was widely practiced suggest, with a certain amount of historical delicacy, that the wooden board wasn't always quite as effective a deterrent as its defenders liked to claim. Premarital pregnancy rates in some of these communities were noticeably elevated. History raises an eyebrow here. It does not pretend to be shocked. I want to ask you something honestly. What do we actually lose by sleeping alone? Not romantically, I mean in the plainest human sense. For nearly the entire span of recorded history, sleep was fundamentally a social act. People fell asleep within easy earshot of others and woke the same way. The last sensation before unconsciousness wasn't silence and isolation, but the sound of somebody else's breathing nearby, the small warmth of another body, the simple, unspoken knowledge that you were not alone in the dark. There's genuine research suggesting this shared sleeping pattern shaped the actual structure of sleep itself. Historians studying pre-industrial communities have found evidence that people commonly slept in two distinct phases each night, separated by an hour or two of quiet wakefulness somewhere in the middle, a period sometimes referred to in old sources as the first sleep and the watch. During this stretch, a person might simply lie still and think, murmur a quiet prayer, talk softly with whoever lay beside them, or simply rest in that hazy space between sleep and full waking. The single, unbroken 8-hour block of sleep we now think of as normal appears in significant part to be a product of the industrial age and its demand for synchronized labor schedules. The older rhythm of the body seems to have been something looser, more broken, and far less private. I'm not suggesting we return to sharing beds with total strangers. That particular chapter does seem genuinely closed. But I think there's something worth noticing in the plain fact that our ancestors fell asleep, night after night, with other human beings close at hand, and that the sealed, silent, solitary bedroom we've built for ourselves is not some ancient or inevitable arrangement. It's a choice this modern world made, fairly recently and quite deliberately, and it's at least worth knowing that it was a choice. By the time this household had fully settled into its nighttime configuration, parents in the great bed, the youngest rolled out beside them in the trundle, older children up in the loft, any servant tucked into the attic, the house had gone about as quiet as it was going to get, which, as it turns out, was not very quiet at all. The rope bed creaked with every shift of weight. The cornhusk mattress rustled at the smallest movement. Someone coughed softly in the dark. A child murmured something in their sleep. The fire popped once, somewhere in the banked coals. But before any of that, before the last candle was extinguished and the household folded itself down for the night, there had been something else happening in that small, crowded room for the 2 or 3 hours between supper and sleep. Something I think will genuinely surprise you, because the popular image of a colonial evening as solemn and joyless gets this particular piece almost entirely wrong, because these people got bored. They got restless. They told jokes. They argued about small things. They played games that occasionally scandalized the local clergy. And what they built out of those in-between hours, it turns out, was richer, stranger, and far more human than the grim, silent picture we tend to carry around in our heads. Try something for me just for a moment. Put your phone face down. Sit in whatever room you're in right now and let the silence settle over it. Not the paused video kind of silence, real quiet, or as close as you can get to it anywhere in the modern world. How long can you actually sit with it before it starts to feel like something that needs fixing? For most of us, if we're honest, not very long. Decades of on-demand entertainment have trained us to expect that any song, any show, any distraction is available within seconds, and genuine, unstructured quiet starts to feel almost physically uncomfortable. An empty evening with no plan and no screen reads, to most modern minds, like a problem waiting to be solved. Now hold on to that feeling, because it is precisely the feeling an ordinary household in this period simply did not have. Not because they were more patient or more virtuous than we are, but because they had never known anything different. The evening had always been what it was. A few hours of firelight, the people already in your house, and whatever the two of you could make of it together. And what they actually made of it, it turns out, was a great deal more than we usually give them credit for. Let's be precise about something first, because there's a romanticized version of the colonial evening that needs correcting. The version where everyone sits by the fire in gentle, contemplative silence, weaving deep thoughts like quiet philosophers. That isn't quite right. These were ordinary people. They got restless. They gossiped. They told jokes that likely wouldn't land with a modern audience at all. And they played games with an enthusiasm that periodically alarmed the local clergy. The stricter Puritan communities of early New England had tried, with only partial success, to ban dice games, card games, and various other amusements they considered contrary to godly living. By the early 1700s, most of those prohibitions had quietly collapsed under the sheer weight of ordinary human nature. So what did a family like this one actually do in the stretch of hours between supper and sleep if the household owned books? And by this point in the century, a meaningful number of ordinary families did reading aloud was the standard evening pastime, and this represents a difference from our own habits worth pausing on. We read privately today, silently, each of us sealed inside our own head. In a household like this one, reading was far more often a shared activity. One person read aloud while everyone else listened, mended, spun, or simply sat with it. The book itself became a social event rather than a solitary one. But what books exactly? The picture here is more varied than the popular image of grim Puritans hunched exclusively over scripture, though scripture was certainly present in most homes. By the middle of the century, an appetite for lighter reading, what contemporary sources sometimes called simple diversions or entertaining tailies, was growing steadily across every level of colonial society. Cheap single-sheet broadsides, printed on one side and sold for a penny, had been circulating since the late 1600s and functioned as a kind of newspaper, gossip column, and popular culture all rolled into one. And then there was the almanac, an annually published pamphlet packed with weather predictions, planting calendars, astronomical notes, household tips, and scattered proverbs, arguably the single most widely read secular publication in the entire colonial world. In a world with no broadcast media of any kind, a popular almanac functioned something like a shared cultural text an entire community read and discussed simultaneously. Its little sayings quoted back and forth, argued over, used as conversation starters at the very table we just left. Music was everywhere in this world, and it was always live, because there was simply no other kind available. In wealthier households, a harpsichord or a small parlor organ represented a genuine investment, both financially and in the years of practice required to play one competently. Daughters of prosperous families were routinely taught keyboard instruments not merely as a hobby, but as a visible marker of proper upbringing, discipline, and readiness for eventual marriage. The sound of a daughter working through scales in the evening functioned almost as a form of household productivity in its own right, even though it never showed up on any ledger. But music wasn't confined to wealthy parlors. The fiddle was the true instrument of ordinary colonial life, present in taverns, farmhouses, and gathering places at every social level. It was cheap enough to own, portable enough to carry anywhere, and versatile enough to play everything from a solemn hymn tune to a lively reel. There are documented accounts of communal work parties, neighbors gathering to help a household finish a big seasonal task like cutting and stacking firewood, that ended with a shared supper and someone producing a fiddle for an evening of music and dancing once the labor was done. Work, in these moments, became celebration simply by the addition of a little music at the end of it. Card games deserve far more credit than they usually get in histories of this period, because they were genuinely popular across every class and region, despite the determined efforts of certain ministers to stamp them out entirely. Whist, a trick-taking partnership game imported from England, was considered the height of fashionable card play, requiring real strategy and a full evening's engagement from 4 players around a single table with one deck of cards. For households of more modest means, simpler games served the same purpose just as well. Cribbage boards turn up regularly in household inventories from the period. For those who disapproved of playing cards on strictly moral grounds, and there were plenty who did, dice games offered a marginally more defensible alternative, though not by much in the eyes of the stricter clergy. Simple printed board games, sold as cheap broadsides not unlike the penny sheets mentioned earlier, cost almost nothing and could be played by any number of people at once. making them a natural evening activity that worked equally well for children and adults sharing the same room. Conversation, though, was the true entertainment of this age. And I want to be clear that I don't mean that as some consolation prize, as though talking was simply what people settled for because they lacked television. I mean it as a genuine, deliberately cultivated art form, one this world took far more seriously than we generally do today. The conversation of an engaged household in this period wasn't idle small talk. It was practiced, shaped by whatever reading the family had access to, sharpened by the plain fact that the people sitting in your own room were, for most practical purposes, your primary source of intellectual company. There were no broadcasts explaining the day's events to you secondhand. You formed your own views through actual back-and-forth argument, tested them against someone else sitting right across the fire, revised them, or held firm under real pushback. Benjamin Franklin understood this dynamic better than almost anyone of his era. In 1727, he founded a weekly discussion club in Philadelphia, a gathering of a dozen tradesmen and craftsmen, none of them wealthy, none university educated, who met every Friday evening to share books, debate questions of morality and civic life, and deliberately practice the art of honest discussion under a set of rules Franklin himself devised. Each member was expected to bring a genuine question to every meeting. Members were explicitly discouraged from arguing their own opinions with visible heat or stubborn pride. The stated goal was mutual understanding, not simply winning the argument. That club, by most accounts, met more or less continuously for decades. Decades of Friday evenings, spent talking by candlelight. There's something worth nomming here carefully, and I want to be careful not to slide into simple nostalgia. The version that says the past was simply better and leaves it there. I don't think it was better. I think it was harder in nearly every way that actually matters. The colonial evening had genuine pleasures, but it also came wrapped in cold, illness, boredom, and all the ordinary friction of people who genuinely could not get away from one another, because there was, quite literally, nowhere else to go. But I do think there's an honest question worth sitting with. When we gained the ability to fill every quiet moment with something, when a screen became available for every waiting room, every train ride, every stray 10 minutes before sleep, what exactly did we trade away for that convenience? What kind of attention, what kind of real conversation, what kind of unhurried thinking is only really possible when the evening comes with no programming attached to it at all? Do you have a friend you haven't genuinely talked to in months? Talk the way people once talked over a shared fire, without either of you also glancing at a phone? I don't ask that to make anyone feel guilty. I ask it because I think it's a fair question the colonial evening quietly puts to ours. The fiddle is put away now. The cards have been gathered up and set aside. The candle has been trimmed one last time. And before this household turns in for the night, there was one more thing an ordinary family in this period almost always did, regardless of wealth, region, or denomination. They braced themselves for whatever the night might bring. Because in a world with no modern medicine, no hospitals nearby, and no real certainty that everyone under that roof would wake up well the next morning, the possibility of illness striking in the dark wasn't some abstract worry sitting at the back of the mind. It was simply part of how the evening ended. Picture this. It's well past midnight. The fire has burned down low. The house is quiet, the children asleep, and you yourself are finally drifting toward rest after a day that began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Then a sound, a cough. Not an ordinary cough, the kind with something different underneath it. Wet, persistent, the kind that makes a parent's stomach drop before the mind has even fully caught up. You lie still for a second, 2 seconds, listening, hoping it passes. It doesn't pass. You get up. Now hold this question for a moment, because it's the one this whole chapter turns on. What do you actually do next? In our world, the answer involves a thermometer, a phone, an all-night pharmacy, and if things turn serious, an emergency room staffed by people who trained for a decade to be there. That whole infrastructure is woven so deeply into modern life that we barely register it as infrastructure at all. It's simply what you do. In the household we've been sitting with tonight, none of that existed. Not a single piece of it. What happened when someone fell sick after dark in a home like this one was a story of genuine improvisation, real love, and a medicine cabinet that, by our standards, sat somewhere between mostly useless and actively dangerous. Start with a fact that tends to catch people off guard: the sheer scarcity of trained physicians in this world. One estimate for the mid-18th century colonies as a whole, a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, holding a population somewhere near 2 million, puts the number of formally degreed physicians at only a couple of hundred. Most of these had trained in Edinburgh or London, because there wasn't a single proper medical school anywhere in the colonies until one finally opened in Philadelphia in the 1760s. Before that, the vast majority of people practicing as doctors had simply apprenticed under someone more experienced for a few years and then set up on their own. What they carried in their heads was a genuine mix of careful observation, inherited folk wisdom, and theories we would now, politely, call badly mistaken. Even where a doctor existed nearby, summoning one cost real money most families didn't have to spare, and travel over poor rural roads meant a physician living even 10 miles off might as well have lived on the far side of an ocean on a bad winter night. The plain reality of rural life in this period is that most families, most of the time, handled their own sick entirely on their own. So who was the actual medical authority inside a household like this one? The mother. Not by any formal training or credential anyone today would recognize, but through knowledge accumulated across generations of women watching each other manage illness, keeping notes and remedies scrawled in the back pages of household account books, growing and drying the herbs that made up the entire family medicine cabinet. Printed household guides of the period routinely folded medical instructions in right alongside recipes for bread and preserves, because the line between cooking and healing was never drawn very sharply to begin with. The woman who knew how to make a poultice was, quite often, the very same woman who'd made supper an hour earlier. Widely circulated household guides of the era carried titles that said the quiet part out loud, plain manuals aimed squarely at ordinary families, offering simple remedies drawn mostly from whatever grew locally, on the explicit premise that most people would need to treat themselves, because no one else was coming. These books went through edition after edition and were read, quite literally, by candlelight in farmhouses up and down the colonies, by women who were, at 2 in the morning, the only medical resource their family had. When fever arrived in the night, and fever was the great terror of this world, the symptom that so often preceded the era's most lethal diseases, the response tended to follow a fairly consistent pattern, one that mixed genuine, sound care with treatments we now know did real harm. Herbs came first: chamomile, sage, mint, wormwood, lavender, not decorative garden plants but actual medical supplies. Household guides commonly recommended plenty of fluids for a feverish patient, weak tea, watered wine sharpened with a little lemon, or a mild herbal infusion. And honestly, this wasn't bad advice at all. Chamomile does have genuine mild calming properties, and encouraging fluids in a feverish patient holds up perfectly well under modern medicine. Bloodletting, on the other hand, did not hold up. By this point, the practice of deliberately opening a vein or applying leeches to draw blood had sat at the center of Western medicine for well over 1,000 years, and it remained there because it appeared to work. Fevers sometimes did subside after a bloodletting, and patients sometimes did report feeling better afterward. What nobody yet understood, germ theory was still more than a century away, was that any improvement happened despite the treatment, not because of it. The underlying theory held that illness resulted from an imbalance among 4 bodily humors, and that drawing off the excess would restore balance. In practice, the treatment sometimes weakened a patient so severely that they could no longer recover from whatever illness had prompted it in the first place. It's a grim historical irony that this same practice, taken to its extreme, is widely believed to have contributed to the death of the young nation's own first president at the close of the century, when his physicians drew off a truly staggering portion of his blood in a single day trying to treat what was most likely a bacterial throat infection. For childhood fevers specifically, the stakes ran almost unbearably high. Diphtheria epidemics swept repeatedly through colonial New England across this century, and in at least one documented outbreak in the 1730s, a single small colony lost well over 1,000 children in barely 2 years, the overwhelming majority of them under the age of 10. One contemporary writer called it, starkly, the plague among children. Some families lost half their surviving children in a single bad season. A parent sitting up through the night with a feverish child wasn't being overly anxious. They were making a real calculation, hour by hour, about whether this was the ordinary fever that passed or the one that didn't. Here's what strikes me most: reading the surviving diaries and household records of women managing sickness through the night in this world. The mothers who sat up until dawn, counting breaths, laying on warm cloths, burning herbs, praying, calculating, worrying without pause. I don't feel pity for them exactly. What I feel is something closer to awe, not because their medicine was good, it mostly wasn't. Not because their circumstances were acceptable, they were genuinely frightening. But because of what they brought to that fear, complete, undivided attention, the full depth of their care, and the total absence of the thing we sometimes quietly substitute for both, the comfortable feeling of having handed the problem off to some larger system. When a modern parent calls a pediatric nurse line at 3 in the morning, there's enormous relief in hearing a trained professional voice on the other end, and I would never trade that relief away. The medicine behind it genuinely saves lives. But something occasionally gets lost in that transfer too, the particular quality of presence that only exists when you are the only resource your child has. When the warm cloth on the forehead is the entirety of what medicine looks like tonight. Have you ever sat up through a whole night with someone you loved who was sick? Not in a hospital waiting room, but at home, in the specific darkness of 3 in the morning, doing the small things you could do and feeling the sharp edges of everything you couldn't. If you have, you felt some faint echo of what this was, night after night, for every parent in this kind of household, every winter, for as long as this way of life lasted. There's one more piece of illness in this world that doesn't translate easily into modern understanding, and it's this: the sick person almost never left the house. There were essentially no hospitals for ordinary people anywhere in the colonies through most of this century. The very first, founded in Philadelphia at mid-century, served mainly the urban poor, and for the vast majority of families, illness happened at home, was treated at home, and resolved, one way or the other, at home. The sick room was a domestic space, and the person tending it was almost always a family member. All the smells, sounds, and unbroken intimacy of that vigil unfolded inside the walls of the ordinary house, which meant, among other things, that death, too, was a domestic experience in a way it has almost entirely stopped being in the modern world. When someone in a household like this one died, they died in the same room where they had slept and eaten and lived their whole life. The family was present. Often the children were present too. There was no quiet removal to some separate institution, no gentle buffering of the ending from the rest of daily life. It simply happened there in the house, witnessed together by everyone under that roof. I don't share this to be mournful. I share it because I think it shaped, in ways that ran deep, how this family thought about every ordinary evening, including the ones that ended perfectly well. The awareness that illness could arrive at any hour without warning, that the night carried no professional safety net, that the people you loved were entirely, only in your own care. That awareness gave every evening in this house a texture we've largely been able to push out of our peripheral vision today. The card games, the fiddle music, the reading aloud by firelight, all of it happened against a backdrop this family could never fully set aside. And perhaps, precisely because they couldn't set it aside, they took none of the healthy evenings quite so much for granted. The herbs are put away now. The chamomile has gone cold in its cup. The fire needs tending one final time before the house can properly rest. And it's in these last quiet minutes before sleep, once the sick have been settled and the fear has either passed or been carefully held at bay, that this family turned to something that had, in truth, run quietly beneath every hour of the whole evening without ever being named outright: their prayers, their particular rituals, the specific spiritual shape of a night like this one. We've spent a long evening together inside this one small house. We watched the last light of a sunset arrive like a quiet emergency. We sat by the hearth and learned that fire was never decoration. It was survival, tended hour by hands that never stopped calculating. We saw what actually filled the table, and who was permitted to sit at it, and who stood silently at its edge. We held a candle and understood, really understood, what a single hour of light actually cost a family like this one. We followed a mother into the long, uncounted hours of her evening labor. We put children to bed with a prayer that acknowledged, gently and without flinching, that they might not wake. We played a hand of cards and listened for a fiddle. We sat up through the dark with someone who was sick, armed with nothing but chamomile tea and a well-worn household manual, trying to love our way through what medicine of the era simply could not fix. Now we arrive at the very last hour, the hour that comes after everything else has finally been done, when the last candle has burned down about as far as it usefully can, and the house is, at last, genuinely quiet. Here's something that might surprise you. In many households of strict religious observance, the single household candle was sometimes deliberately blown out during the evening's family prayers. This wasn't carelessness or an attempt to save a few extra minutes of wax. It was intentional. Ministers and devout families alike, even those already living on modest means, are recorded as choosing to extinguish the light specifically for the recitation of evening prayer, rather than let it burn on through it. Darkness, in this context, wasn't an inconvenience to be tolerated. It was part of the posture itself. You didn't need to see anything in particular to speak honestly with God. If anything, in this understanding, the darkness was exactly where real honesty lived. What a household like this one brought to evening prayer rested on an understanding of nighttime that's genuinely difficult to fully recreate in a modern imagination. For the devout families of this era, Puritan and Anglican alike, whatever their particular denomination, going to sleep was never simply a biological necessity. It was treated as a small surrender, a kind of brief death in miniature. The body laying its consciousness down, releasing its grip on the day, entering a state nobody fully controlled, and from which a safe return was never technically guaranteed. This is why evening devotions in many households were built specifically around a quiet, private accounting, reviewing the day's behavior honestly, giving thanks for whatever had gone well, admitting quietly to whatever had been said or done that shouldn't have been, and then, quite deliberately, making a kind of peace with one's own mortality before closing one's eyes. Some ministers of the period wrote openly about this practice, describing it plainly as preparing the soul for whatever the night might bring. And what strikes me every time I sit with this material is how little theatrical performance was involved. This wasn't melodrama. It was, by the standards of the world these families actually lived in, simply good sense. In a world where a single bad diphtheria season could take 1,000 children from one small colony in barely 2 years, in a world where a fever arriving after midnight might be ordinary or might be the beginning of the end, the real possibility that you might not wake up in the morning was not some abstract philosophical exercise. It was a reasonable, statistically grounded concern. Preparing yourself for it, night after night, was simply prudent. The shape of these evening devotions varied somewhat by region and denomination, but the underlying pattern is recognizable across the colonial world. In many Puritan New England households, family prayers were a fixed, non-negotiable institution, one of several set devotional moments that structured a devout family's whole day, alongside morning prayer and the blessing said before meals. Scripture was often read straight through in sequence, chapter after chapter, rather than in isolated comforting passages chosen for the occasion. The entire text, start to finish in order. A psalm might be sung. Prayers were typically offered not from any printed prayer book but composed on the spot, in the Father's own words, itself considered a genuine skill, and one that carried real social weight in a community where the quality of a man's household prayers reflected directly on his standing. There's a moving surviving account from a New England minister of the previous generation, describing a quiet evening spent kneeling beside his young daughter, walking her gently through a conversation about her own soul, before finally praying over her with a kind of raw, repeated insistence that God would watch over her and keep her safe. Here was a man who understood, as every parent in this world understood, that the child kneeling beside him might not live to see adulthood, whose own large family had already lost several children along the way, and who chose, in the full weight of that knowledge, not despair, but stubborn hope spoken out loud anyway. Not certainty. He didn't have certainty. Just a quiet refusal to stop hopping, even in the dark, even at the very end of a long day, even knowing everything he already knew. In Anglican households further south, the texture looked a little different, but the underlying gesture was the same. The Book of Common Prayer, carried over from the English Church, contained a specific form for evening worship that structured the close of the day for Anglican families across the colonial world. Its language moving back and forth between honest acknowledgement of failure and quiet affirmation of grace, in a rhythm families heard so often across a lifetime that it became something closer to the grammar of their inner lives than a text to be debated. The words settled into people the way music settles into a person, not as doctrine to argue over, but as something simply inhabited. By the middle of the century, a wave of intense religious revival that swept across the colonies had added a further layer to this whole spiritual landscape, a more emotionally immediate, personally urgent strain of faith that asked not merely whether a family observed the correct rituals, but whether each person had genuinely felt a real, transformative encounter with God. This shift touched even households that would have described themselves as comfortably moderate in their faith. By the time evening prayer was spoken in a house like this one, in the 1750s, it likely carried both currents at once, the old structured forms, and this newer, more urgent emotional charge running quietly together in the same small room. And then the prayers ended. This, I think, is where the colonial night becomes most interesting, not in the words of the prayer itself, which we can reconstruct fairly reliably from surviving texts, but in what came after. In the particular quality of silence that settled once the last Amen had been spoken. The candle, if it hadn't already been snuffed, was put out now. The fire, if it was still glowing, was left to ease down on its own, or carefully banked under its cover for the night, exactly as we described hours ago at the start of this whole evening. The last person awake carried a small candlestick from room to room on one final circuit of the house. What did a night like this one actually sound like? Historians who have reconstructed the pre-industrial experience of nighttime from thousands of surviving diaries and letters have found something that surprises most modern readers. People of this era often describe the night as remarkably loud, in ways city dwellers today almost never experience. Not loud with human noise, loud with the world itself. Wind finding every gap in unsealed wooden walls and speaking with every shift in weather. Animals settling in the barn and out across the fields. In colder months, the sharp crack of ice forming across a nearby pond. And underneath all of it, for anyone with an ear for it, the sound of other people breathing nearby. This last detail is the one I keep returning to, because I think it matters more than almost any other single fact in understanding the actual emotional texture of an evening like this one. In a world where people commonly shared a single bed, where children slept alongside their parents, where a servant might sleep in the very same room as the family, where the whole idea of private sleeping space simply didn't exist the way it does now. The very last thing you heard before sleep was almost always another human being's breath. Not a device. Not something a screen had chosen to play for you. Another living person, present, nearby, real. I want to say something now about what this whole long evening adds up to, not a tidy lesson, because I'm honestly not interested in tidy lessons, but an observation offered as plainly as I can manage. We began tonight at sunset, watching an ordinary family race the dying light to finish everything a single day demanded of them. We end here in the dark, listening to the sound of breathing. In between, we spent real time with people who had almost nothing we consider basic today. No electric light, no central heat, no antibiotics, no ambulance a phone call away. People who blew out their one candle during prayer because candles were too precious to burn while speaking to God. People who sewed by firelight until their eyes gave out and simply called it an ordinary evening. And yet something threads quietly through every one of these hours that I didn't fully expect when I first sat down to think about this world, and that I'm still not entirely sure how to name. It isn't nostalgia, I want to be clear about that. I wouldn't choose this life, and I don't think you would either. Anyone who claims they would is, I think, romanticizing away the cold, the fear, and the very real early death that ran through every part of it. But there's something in the sheer density of these evenings, the way every hour carried a purpose, and that purpose was immediate and unmistakably human. The fire had to be tended, or the family genuinely suffered for it. The prayers had to be said, because tomorrow was never actually guaranteed. The breathing you heard in the dark wasn't background noise to be tuned out. It was, in a very real sense, the entire point of the evening. There's a question buried in all of this that I think belongs to you now, not to me. What does your own evening actually feel like once it ends? Not what you do with it. I already know what most of us do with it because I do the same things. I mean, when the last screen finally goes dark and the house falls quiet, is there anything there in that quiet? Some small, distant echo of what a family like this one touched every single night without exception? Or have we, somewhere along the way, built so many layers between ourselves and the dark that we can no longer quite feel it at all? I'm not asking that to make anyone feel bad about their phone. I'm asking because I think it's the single most interesting question this whole evening leaves us with. And the fact that you're still here, sitting with a long story about ordinary people in an ordinary house 300 years ago, tells me some part of you may already suspect the answer. The last candle is out now. The fire has settled into a few slow, patient embers. Outside, the night does exactly what it always did in this world, grows darker than anything we're used to, thick with stars in a way almost nobody watching this has ever actually seen with their own eyes, because there's no artificial light for miles in any direction to wash it out. Inside the house, one by one, the breathing slows. The day is finally, fully done. Thank you for spending this whole evening here with me. What we walked through together was never really just a history of houses, routines, or old ways of getting by. It was a portrait of what it means to be human when the margins run thin, when light costs something real, when the night is genuinely dangerous, and when the handful of people you love make up the entire radius of your world. If any part of this evening stayed with you, some small detail that surprised you, some question that opened up rather than closed, I'd honestly love to know which one. Tell me in the comments, and if you've come this far with me tonight, thank you. It means more than I can easily put into words. There are more evenings like this one waiting. More houses, more centuries, more ordinary people whose names history never bothered to write down, but whose lives are still worth every bit of attention we can give them. Until next time, take care of the people under your own roof tonight. Light something warm if you can. And when your last screen finally goes dark, listen, just for a moment, to the sound of the room around you. It holds more than you think.